Hi, everybody. I hope everybody's EAGX virtual is going well so far. My name's Bridget, and I'm the MC for this session, which is on persistence and reversibility of wild animal welfare interventions with Simon, Eckerström, and Liedholm. So to start, we'll have a 10-minute talk by Simon, and then we'll move on to a live Q&A session where he'll respond to your questions. You can submit questions in your name or anonymously using the box to the right-hand side of this video. And you can also vote for your favorite questions to push them up higher in the queue. And we'll try to get through as many as we can. Then, after around 30 minutes of questions, I'll bring the Q&A session to an end, but that's not the end of the session. To help you think through and apply the ideas you've heard, I'll be asking you to join a 20-minute icebreaker session where you'll have 2 speed meetings with other attendees to discuss your thoughts on the content. I'll explain how to do that when we get there. But now I'd like to introduce our speaker for this session. Simon Eckerström Liedholm is a researcher at Wild Animal Initiative. He's worked on questions of strategy and prioritization and is currently investigating fertility control for wild animals. He finished his PhD in ethology at Stockholm University last year. And Simon is also a board member of EA Sweden. Here's Simon.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Simon, and I'm a researcher at Wild Animal Initiative. Our mission is to conduct and facilitate research on how to improve the lives of wild animals. So today I'm going to be talking about persistence and reversibility of wild animal welfare interventions. This talk is based on a report that we published in December of 2019 on this topic. I will start by defining what I mean by persistence. By persistence, I mean the expected duration of the counterfactual effects of an action. I say expected to indicate that we are interested in the likely persistence before any action has been taken. And by counterfactual, I mean that we are interested in effects that wouldn't have come about otherwise. I do not consider repeated action to sustain something to be classified as persistent. So for instance, even though your room might stay clean for like years on end, any individual act of cleaning will not have a persistent effect. Although if you know a way to do that, then please tell me. Okay, so the reason we should care about persistence is that a beneficial intervention that lasts longer, all else equal, is preferable to a shorter one, since there's more time for the beneficial effects to accumulate, basically. Just to give an example of a persistent effect, here's a picture of the Great Wall of China, parts of which are more than 1,000 years old. Anecdotally, it seems to have an effect on gene flow between populations of plants on different sides of the wall. So possibly it will also have effects on animal populations. Okay, so we'll get back to persistence later on. But for now, let's turn to reversibility. Reversibility has turned out to be somewhat harder to pin down. So if you want to read more about the details of our thinking on this, you should check out the report. I've included a link to it on the last slide. In any case, I will define reversibility as the fraction of the effects of an intervention that should be reversed so as to maximize the expected utility of a reversal given a bad outcome. This definition might not be the first thing that comes to your mind when you're thinking about how reversible an action is. So I'll try to explain my thinking a bit here. The first observation to make is that trying to reverse the effects of an action might be easy at first, but will progressively get harder as you go along. In other words, there might be diminishing returns to reversing an action, as I've shown here. So as an example, let's say you spill wheat flour on your floor, and then you try to clean it up, basically. Getting most of it up from the floor will be easy, but making sure that every single particle is taken care of will be much harder. But just because the last particle is virtually impossible to find doesn't really mean that it wasn't at least somewhat reversible. So the likelihood of 100% reversal might not be a good proxy for reversibility. We should also take into account the opportunity cost of reversing an action, where we forsake the ability to use the resources elsewhere. So the optimal degree of reversal could again be lower than the complete reversal if there are diminishing returns to our efforts. In this hypothetical example, trying to get close to 100% reversal will cost us to waste more and more resources with a smaller and smaller payoff, basically. Okay, let's step back a bit. Why should we care whether an action is reversible or not? Firstly, reversible actions maintain option value and allows us to avoid bad, unforeseen consequences. This is especially important when it comes to wild animal welfare, where there's lots of uncertainty. Secondly, to get buy-in from decision makers and the general public, we will have to show that we are not acting recklessly to promote promoting reckless behavior. So there are two other aspects that I think affect the importance of reversibility, and that is future values and future knowledge. So I will start out by talking a bit about future values. So there are a lot of things that we don't know about the values of our descendants. Will our values drift randomly, or will they improve in some sense? To what extent can our descendants' values be thought of as idealized versions of humanity's current values? These are questions that will influence the importance of reversibility. If the values of future humans will get better in some sense, maintaining reversibility will be very important. And if the opposite is true, reversibility will, of course, then be less important. All right, so furthermore, the accumulation of knowledge will also affect the importance of reversibility. If our understanding of the natural world keeps improving, we might want to be able to let our descendants second guess decisions that we are making today, which means that having reversible interventions will be much more important than having persistent interventions if knowledge improves. So on the whole, it seems that we want interventions that are both persistent and reversible. But as you might have already noticed, the concepts are highly related. Interventions that are very persistent will likely be hard to reverse. And this is because the act of reversing an intervention will decrease its persistence. That means we will often have to make trade-offs between persistence and reversibility. And as I mentioned before, there are good reasons to avoid persistent effects that can't be reversed. To tie this abstract reasoning into concrete examples, a low persistence intervention that we are investigating right now is fertility control for pigeons using carbazone. Ovocontrol is the name of the commercial product in the US. Fertility control seems like a promising way to reduce juvenile mortality, competition for resources, and other things. Basically leaving more resources for the remaining individuals in the population. And even though there might be like knock-on effects of reducing populations of pigeons using birth control, the effects of the active ingredient nicarbazone is very short-lived, and breeding resumes after a couple of days when you stop treating the pigeons with nicarbazone. Okay, so that's pretty promising. But what if there's a way to design interventions that are both persistent and reversible? So these are two hypothetical lines representing interventions under different levels of human capabilities. And then on the y-axis, you see the persistence of the interventions. If we look at the far left on side of the horizontal axis, we are in a world where human capabilities have drastically decreased. The green line represents an intervention that is then persistent in the face of natural processes, but as you can see, it's not persistent in the face of human action. Designing interventions this way, we retain the ability to reverse the intervention as long as we have the capability to do so. but their intervention will persist when we either can't or won't reverse it, basically. So if safely developed, genetic engineering could be an example of an intervention or a class of interventions that are both reversible and persistent in the face of natural processes. One would utilize the cellular machinery that preserves genetic material and information down the generations to make it persistent in the face of natural processes. But at the same time, there is no innate resistance to the tools of genetic engineering, because wild animals haven't been exposed to them. And this means that the introduced changes can be reversed if we choose to reverse them. So such methods to limit or reverse the effects of introduced changes have been studied for gene drives, which you can read more about in the report. So the use of genetic engineering have been proposed for combating human pathogens. So for instance, here you have two candidates of genetic engineering that are being proposed. So we have white-footed mice, which are vectors for Lyme disease, and Anopheles mosquitoes, which are vectors for malaria. Although genetic engineering in the wild should not be used before we are sure that the tools are safe and work as intended, I'm generally optimistic about using such methods to improve human health. And if we're willing and able to use genetic engineering to help humans in the future, I see no reason why we couldn't eventually use it to improve wild animal welfare. All right, thank you for listening. Here are some resources you might be interested in. If you want to know more about the content of this talk, you should check out the link to the report down here. Also, we have a few episodes of the podcast Wildness on our website, which I can highly recommend if you want an introduction to wild animal welfare. Thanks.
Okay, thanks so much for that talk, Simon, and thank you very much for joining us here for this live Q&A session now. I see we've had a number of questions submitted on Slido already, but do feel free to keep them coming, everybody at home, and keep voting for the ones that you prefer to see answered. To start, I'm just going to, sorry. First of all, welcome, Simon. Thank you for joining us. So I'll just start off with one of my own questions. So working on fertility control in wild animals, it seems that you must have a view on population ethics for animals on that. What are your views on population ethics, and how does that change how you think about your work and the value of your work?
Yeah, that's right. I think my views on population ethics is quite close to the total view, which means that I'm interested in sort of the sum of the welfare of, let's say, a species. It can seem a bit like you're doing a trade-off where you're using fertility control, which will inevitably reduce the population size. So you're sort of getting fewer individuals and potentially less total welfare, but the average welfare is likely increasing. So there's going to be some optimum there. So my colleague Luke Hecht has written about this. You can find more about it on our webpage. That's an interesting question. I think that using fertility control is something that will be useful to improve the lives of species where you have intense competition for resources, like very high juvenile mortality. I find it hard to see other ways of improving the well-being as much as that by using fertility control. And if you look at it from the perspective of the total sort of biomass or available energy, reducing one population will potentially increase the numbers of another population. So I think if you can keep fertility rates lower, you will for many species. So this is sort of looking far into the future. Then you would sort of get around this problem of changing population sizes. You would get more individuals that live long lives that are potentially more positive than short lives that are sort of very brutish and filled with bad experiences.
Okay, cool. I think that it shows the, I guess, complexity of the work that you do, that you have to cover everything from, moral philosophy to, I guess, questions of animal sentience and also the impact of different interventions. So yeah, it's complicated stuff.
Definitely.
Yeah, I guess on that, just following on from that, do you have a view on kind of what research is needed most to answer this question? Is there an area where you think there should be more attention or less attention in navigating that scope of research?
So do you mean generally for wild animal welfare or something specific? Okay.
Or generally, or if you prefer to focus on this question of fertility control. That's
right. Yeah. So I guess I can answer both, but the question of fertility control, we're currently in contact with researchers who seem to be interested in conducting a study on the effects of fertility control on pigeons. So yeah, that seems promising to me. I think the main value at the moment is trying to find like one sort of narrow intervention where you can find positive effects on welfare, and it has this promising quality of reducing high fertility rates and then reducing juvenile mortality and resource competition. So it won't be perhaps net beneficial, the specific intervention narrowly looking at, if I only do this, will it be like on net positive? Like that's unclear, but I think the usefulness of the intervention goes beyond that. It's trying to find an intervention where it's like, okay, we can find something that's good for pigeons, and this is sort of something we can build on for other species, to just have a sort of proof of concept. I think that's like most of the value in such an intervention.
Okay, sure. So I think I'll jump over to the top rated question in the Slido now. So somebody's gotten quotation marks, so I think this must be something that you've said. Genetic engineering in the wild should not be used until we are sure that tools are safe. What evidence counts as certainty? And it seems like there's a lot of variables to control. So how can you be sure that the tools are safe?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I should say I'm not a geneticist, and I've read a lot about it, these different methods, like for instance, gene drives. And I think that in order to be as sure as you can be that the negative effects, like there aren't large unforeseen negative effects, there's a need for a lot of small scale experiments. So a lot of work in the lab with making sure that you don't have accidental releases of modified animals. And maybe you could use mesocosms, like small semi-natural environments that are closed off from the world. I think you can go a long way using those methods. And I also think that the researchers working on this, for instance, Kevin Esfolt, who I think is giving a talk later in this conference, they are focusing on how to make those methods safe and reliable. So I think I'm not sure exactly how I would answer this. I think at the moment it seems clear that more research on that is needed. And yeah, I think that's my answer.
Yeah, okay. I guess somewhat related to that, there's a question here about noting that a lot of governments already are looking to control or reduce the population of pigeons, mosquitoes, etc. Are they using fertility controls? And if not, why not?
Right. Wait, can you read that again?
Yeah, no. So a lot of governments already seek to control, reduce populations of pigeons, mosquitoes, etc. Do they currently use fertility controls? If not, why not?
Right. Yeah, so in terms of pigeons, I think mostly they do not use fertility control. So it's quite common to use trapping, poisoning. So this goes for a lot of other pest animals. So poisoning, trapping, or just trying to ward them off in some way. So I think fertility control is very, very new for pest species. So there's one example in terms of insects where I guess you could call it fertility control. So it's using something called the sterile insect technique. And it has been used for, I would guess, almost 60 years, since the 1950s, I think, in the US, to reduce the populations of screwworm. So screwworm is a type of parasite that basically the female fly lays eggs in open wounds on animals, and the larvae, they basically eat the flesh, and it's very painful for the animal that is inflicted by this. So there's been a lot of work to basically eradicate screwworms from southern North America and basically all of Central America. The screwworm is still present in South America. But yeah, so that I guess that could qualify as a fertility control measure. It seems more humane than other methods of lethal control, and it's affecting the fertility. But generally, I think it's uncommon.
Yeah, okay. And it seems like there might be a difference here between interventions that are aiming at promoting human welfare. So there is, mosquito control programs, but the considerations might be different when the animal welfare is actually your primary concern.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah. And a kind of related question is, could fertility control cause depression among animals?
Yes, I think that in some cases, I guess it can. It's kind of unclear. I've read some reports where it seems that the behavior has changed for some mammals in particular. I think those are the ones that have been studied more closely on this. Yeah, I'm not sure. I guess taking sort of a consequentialist perspective, that it might be the case that some females, I guess mainly, would to some extent suffer the loss of not having offspring, or thinking that they're having offspring but they don't, or that it changes the physiology or sort of neurochemistry that makes them depressed or something similar. But I guess you'd have to weigh that against the potential benefits for juveniles. Yeah, it would be interesting to see more research on that, though.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So another question we've got is about thinking about the cascades on I guess other animals. So if you're intervening with the aim of promoting one species welfare, what effects will there be on other species? How do you go about including that and thinking about that?
Yeah, so I thought about that a lot. I think it's generally very tricky. It's hard to estimate even the direct effects of things you do on the species that you're trying to treat in some way. So knowing what the indirect effects are is just very hard. So going back to the example of fertility control for pigeons, for instance, I think it's, as I said, like I think it's the main value of it is sort of like a test case of something that can be extended. So I see it as like if we could extend it much further to many different species, I find it hard, like it seems more plausible that that would be net positive. Changing the conditions for one species so that you have it compensating changes in some other species, that could be problematic, but sort of improving the welfare of many species at the same time seem to be a better approach. But yeah, I'm somewhat unsure about that argument, so would be interested in if someone disagrees with me and why.
Okay. It could be something that people pick up in the small group discussions that we have afterwards.
Definitely.
So another question is, are there any examples of human intervention in an ecosystem that have gone well, aside from conservation work?
Right. I would say that the example of screwworms, the eradication of screwworms, that seems like something that is pretty clearly positive, as far as I can tell. So yeah, it's improved the well-being of domesticated animals, quite likely wild animals as well, and humans. But yeah, it's just very hard to tell when you take into account sort of indirect effects on the population sizes of other species. But in general, I guess you would have to, like the screwworm seems to have a very specific niche. So it's feeding on the flesh of mammals, for instance. And I can't see really how that is sort of replaced by another species. Like the effect would likely be that the populations of wild mammals would increase. And that's obviously hard to establish what the net effect of that is. But yeah, I'm sort of excited about the long-term progress of the research field of improving wild animal welfare. And then, yeah, I guess it's more interesting to me whether it sort of indicates a positive step towards something that can be used on a broader scale, rather than right now on the margin, is this net positive?
Okay. So I guess coming back to the focus of your talk in these two different factors in persistence and reversibility, somebody's asked to not appear reckless, wouldn't it be better to choose interventions that aren't persistent in the first place and that need constant upkeep? Yeah,
I think that's a good point. I tried to make that in the talk actually. I think there's a strong argument for doing that, and sort of definitely at least starting small scale. So this is related to the uncertainty around the effects. So if you can reduce the uncertainty, then yeah, you might be able to move further on the persistence scale, so to speak. But yeah, I've at least found one example where, because the negative effects of persistence seems to come from not being able to reverse something. So that is why I think genetic engineering seems promising, at least in theory. Like hopefully we'll be able to perfect these methods so that they can be used. But then you sort of get around the issues with persistence that you're sort of locking in a bad state. So you can have this persistent effect if we choose not to do anything about it, like if we choose not to interfere with the intervention or the action that we've taken. But we always have the opportunity to reverse the effects to some significant extent.
Yeah, okay, cool. So there's a question here about wild animal initiative and specifically asking about incorporating a long-termist perspective into wild animal suffering, and even more specifically, the relationship between artificial intelligence and wild animal suffering. I guess if you could perhaps give a bit of an overview to the organisation Wild Animal Initiative, and maybe give us some insight into the work that is happening within the team, and then also to talk specifically to those questions about long-termist perspective and the potential role of AI.
Yeah, sounds good. You might have to remind me about the different parts, because there were many parts of that question.
Yeah, no worries.
But yeah, so I think what our main focus is try to sort of foster and facilitate research on wild animal welfare, and that is at least as far as I can see, is sort of directed towards trying to have like long-term positive progress in terms of understanding and being able to act in terms of improving wild animal welfare. I think it's sort of you have these reinforcing effects that if people think that there are no ways of improving wild animal welfare, they have a much harder time extending empathy towards wild animals. I think, yeah, this is sort of one piece of the puzzle to try to do more research on how to improve the life of wild animals, so that people can see, well, there seems to be some things that we can do that seem reasonably reliable and promising in the long term. Yeah, so that's generally what we're about, I think. Some specific things that we've been working on that I'm excited about is biomarkers of aging as indicators of cumulative welfare, something that Will Bradshaw worked on last year. So basically looking at telomere attrition to figure out the effects of stress and negative experiences on your physiology, so that you can then measure the attrition of telomeres as a proxy for how much stress or distress that you've experienced during your life. So that's something that I find very interesting. We've also worked on measuring welfare in terms of welfare expectancy. So this is something that my colleague Luke Hecht has been working on, and has a preprint out on that. It can be found on our webpage, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, so basically looking at taking the age-specific mortality. So what is the mortality rate during a certain age interval, and then looking at, like, assuming that that's a good proxy of welfare during that period. So if many individuals die, like half of the individuals in that age group die, then that indicates that it's probably not conducive to welfare being in that interval. And then just sort of looking across the lifespan of that species to see what is the sort of sum of this. Does it seem like it has constant positive, or like, does it seem to have a lot of negative experiences, or is it? I guess this. Okay, so I should qualify or be a bit more concrete. In this case, it's hard to know what the net welfare is. So this is measuring things in a relative sense. You can sort of order species in terms of this species seems to have more positive welfare than this species. But yeah, so that is one approach. I think it's very promising. And there's lots of other things. Hollis, my colleague, has worked on looking at humane insecticides. So looking at different insecticides that are in use at the moment and trying to figure out which ones seem to be conducive to welfare or less that induce less suffering. Maybe the individual dies faster, or we can assess whether it suffers more or less. So he published that, or they, sorry, published that recently, I think it was last year. Yeah, so those are some of the examples that we've been working on. And then the question was something about AI.
Yeah, so I guess what do you think of the intersection between, or what is the relevance of artificial intelligence for wild animal suffering?
Right. I think it has an impact on the questions of persistence. So it's fairly relevant in this to this framework. So it seems reasonable to assume that if we manage to create an artificial general intelligence that has very sort of extraordinary capabilities compared to humans, and are able to is able to sort of change the world in ways that would be beneficial from that agent's point of view, we can expect that the world will change quite drastically. So I guess that is like that possibility makes persistence in expectation produces persistence. So if you think it's likely that an artificial general intelligence would make changes that are very pervasive in a short period, like not that far into the future, then that would tell us that persistence is likely lower of actions we take today.
Okay, cool. So there's another question here about the importance of public perception for making progress in the area. And I feel like you touched on that a little bit in that some of you, if I interpreted correctly, some of the value of your work is showing people that it might actually be possible to make progress. But yeah, just more broadly speaking, what's the role of public perception, and is that something that comes into wild animal initiatives, I guess decision making and deciding what to work on and what kind of work to do?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's something that's very important to consider. Like, we're not operating in some kind of vacuum where we sort of strip away all the people of the world and think about our actions in terms of the effects, and that there are no sort of feedback effects that people react to our actions. So yeah, I think it's important to keep that in mind. I think it's a balance. You have to thread a needle between wanting to be clear what we think is sort of a good future, and sort of explaining what we think is a good future given certain constraints. Yeah, so I think we definitely think about public perception a lot, and I think that's important.
Okay, cool. We are coming towards the end of the session, so this will be, I guess, the last question. But I guess just to finish up, is there, you had the link to the report, I think, on your last slide. What else would you recommend that people could look into if they're interested in learning more about this area, and also what kind of opportunities might be available to people that might be interested in engaging further?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. I think that if you're interested in the sort of framework of persistence and reversibility, there's a report or a write-up by Stefan Schubert and forgot his name. It's cited in my report. So if you go there and look at the references, you'll find it. And that's on a very sort of similar topic of like retaining option value by maybe avoiding highly persistent effects. other than that, I think, well, in terms of if people want to engage more with this question, I just highly recommend that people think about it and write up their thoughts, or yeah, just expand on this thinking and prove me wrong if I'm wrong in some sense. It would be very interesting to see more work on this.
Great. All right. Well, Simon, thanks so much for joining us today. That's the end of this Q&A session. So everybody who's watching at home, don't go away just yet. Discussing new ideas with other people can be a really good way to understand them. So we're going to use the last 20 minutes of the session for a couple of short speed meetings with other attendees. So if you check the session description below this video, you'll find a link to an icebreaker session where we're going to gather for those meetings. So please click on that link now and a new host will meet you on the other side. Thanks very much for watching.